I think every knitter has experienced the fantasy of quitting your day job and just becoming a knitter full time, getting to knit all day and get paid for it. What a dream, right? Well, I'm here to tell you that I've experienced that dream. I started my career with an internship at Vogue Knitting magazine. After college, I became a craft DIY and knitting book editor at a publishing company in New York City. So let's talk about how to make knitting your job and whether you actually want to. We'll start by talking about some of the more traditional or popularized paths to making knitting your job, like pattern design and becoming an indie dyer. And after we talk about those two, I'll share what I actually think is a more practical and sustainable way to make knitting your job. To start, let's talk about knitting pattern design. And I actually think that dream of becoming a knitting pattern designer isn't as dreamy as you might think. Social media and Instagram have really changed the game when it comes to knitting pattern design because it's opened the doors for almost anyone to become a knitwear designer. Is that a good thing? I'm not so convinced. Plus, designing knitwear patterns takes a lot more than just creativity and a love of knitting. It takes a deep knowledge of knitting techniques if you want to do it right. And it takes a lot of moving pieces. I'm talking about hiring and paying for a tech editor. I'm talking about potentially working with a graphic designer to make your pattern look nice. I'm talking about yes, managing test knitters, if that's something that you're doing. Managing a social media campaign to advertise and popularize your pattern. There's so much work that goes into making any knitwear pattern kind of like launch successfully or launch with a big enough following to even pay back the cost of the tech editor. The truth of the matter is, a majority of people who are designing knitwear patterns, especially people who are posting their patterns online, they are not making enough money to quit their day job. If you want to become a knitwear designer, there's really one thing you need, and it's a big following. You need a large following to really quit your day job as a knitwear designer. And so diving in and designing patterns, although it may be a fun creative outlet, maybe something you enjoy, I would actually recommend focusing on building your social media following first. If you don't have a built-in audience, you're not going to be able to succeed in that field. So really focus on the social media first. Now, indie yarn dyeing is very, very similar to indie pattern design in that social media following is kind of necessary in order to make any kind of money from it. You might notice that some of the big name indie dyers who have gone from very small and independent to really, really big have leveraged pop culture moments as their colorway names, and that has really inspired people to purchase their yarn. Are you going to be leveraging a viral moment, a pop culture moment? What is that moment? How are you going to stand out among all the other people making a Taylor Swift colorway? How is yours going to be special and different? And is there enough interest in the knitting world to make people leap to buy that yarn, to sell it out as soon as it launches? Ultimately, I think one of the biggest problems with knitwear design and yarn dyeing today is that it's extremely saturated. So many people are out here trying to design knitting patterns, to sell hand-dyed yarn. In order to stand out, it's become harder and harder. So let's talk about some slightly less competitive ways to work in the knitting industry before we work our way up to what I think is the most sustainable and the best way to work in the knitting industry. If you are an experienced knitter, your door opens to potentially teach knitting. And there are lots and lots of places and ways to teach knitting. You can go to your local yarn store and see if they are looking for new teachers to teach classes there. Or if they're looking for people to work in the yarn store on the weekend, it's not going to be super lucrative, but it could cover your yarn budget and maybe you get a little discount with the yarn store. You could also teach at festivals. There are sheep and wool festivals and different knitting conventions across the country and across the world all year long. One thing about those is that you do have to apply like 8 to 10 months out to teach at those festivals, and they may not say yes to your application. So you can start thinking today about like, if you could teach a knitting skill, what do you feel confident to teach? And is there something special that you can teach that others aren't doing? And you can start to look up when teaching applications open for different sheep and wool festivals across the country and start putting your name out there. Start testing the waters and seeing if people are interested in what you have to teach. Now, to be clear, you're only going to make a couple $100 to maybe $1,000 teaching knitting in one festival. If you have a larger social media following and a little bit of knitting celebrity status, it will definitely be easier for you to get chosen for those knitting teaching gigs. And I'll throw this in here, but this is not the easiest route to take, but I do think that it's a good one. Can you innovate in the knitting world? Can you create a knitting innovation? When I think about knitting innovation, I think about the Yarnet. I think about the Lumos knitting lamp. I think about the twister, portable yarn holder. I think about these inventions and innovations where knitters thought to themselves, you know what, I really need a fill in the blank and I'm gonna invent it. And they went ahead and did it. Is it lucrative? Is it a big enough deal to quit your day job? That would be a question for the founders. And I would argue it's gonna be hard to make such a niche item become big enough within such a small knitting world to actually quit your day job. But if it's a really great idea, I could see it taking off. And selfishly, I think that we need more fun and exciting knitting tools. So if you can come up with one and invent it, go for it. I'd love to see it. Now, before we dive into what I think is the best way to get a job in the knitting world, I just want to say a word of caution. If knitting is the thing that you love, it brings you joy. It brings you calm. At the end of the day, you had a long day at work. You went into the office. You don't love it. You come home, you kick off your shoes, you sit in front of the couch, you pull out your knitting. That is your moment of zen. That is your moment of calm. Knitting brings you joy. All of those elements of work, the frustrations, the dealing with difficult people, the having to show up every day, whether or not you feel like it, none of that applies to your knitting until you make knitting your job. When knitting becomes your job, all of the frustrations that come with work get applied onto your knitting. All of the difficult things that you don't want to think about get applied onto your knitting. I'm talking about taxes. I'm talking about paperwork. I'm talking about managing people. I'm talking about being managed. I'm talking about the stress of having to show up every day and do this thing, even if you don't feel like it. I'm talking about the pressures of showing up and selling on social media. Like, all of this is a lot. It's a lot of work, and it's a lot of emotional energy. And if knitting is your hobby and it's something that you love to do to relax, really think about whether you want to make it your job. Because once it becomes your job, it may not give you that same feeling of peace and calm that it did before. And even though the fantasy of knitting being your job is that you get to do the thing you love all day, every day, at the end of the day, when you want to relax, you may not want to look at your knitting again. You may be over it by the end of the day. Do you want knitting to become something you don't want to look at? Because that is what working in the knitting industry can do. Does it always do? No. But can it do? Yes. It's just a word of caution and a word of warning. So I think the best way to actually get a job in the knitting industry is to take a skill you already have, a professional skill you already have outside of knitting. How can you take those skills and apply them professionally within a company that does knitting stuff? Like, let's say you're an event planner. If you can find a company that organizes knitting events like retreats or conventions or conferences, and you can take your event planning skills and apply them to knitting events, that is a way for you to get into the knitting world using the professional skill set you already have. Getting a job within a knitting company is probably not going to pay as lucratively as getting a job working for any just like major corporation. The budgets are smaller, but you're working with what you love. So is it worth it to you to take a pay cut to work in a company that's doing knitting related stuff? Like, you'll probably get some free yarn or some free knitting stuff. You might get to attend a knitting conference for free. Are those benefits of being in that industry and in that world enough to accept a lower salary? So how do you get a job in one of these knitting companies? I think that one of the main things you can do is to build your portfolio. And if you can apply knitting to that portfolio to really cater it to the job you're applying for and show them that the work that you do is related to knitting, you can show them that your skill set is really applicable to what they're trying to hire for. I also think that networking is really important. How can you connect with the people who can help you get the job you want? Are you going to attend an event like Rhinebeck and go to the booths of the companies you are interested in and introduce yourself? Hey, this is who I am. Here's my business card. Here's what I want to do for your company. Are you hiring? If you're not, can I give you my card? Can I email you? Can you keep my resume on file so that when you are hiring, I'm the first person in mind? Can you go up to a smaller brand and say, hey, I'm a tech editor. I noticed that you design knitting patterns. If you ever need tech editing services, I'm here. Here's my card. How can you utilize events like knitting conferences and sheep and wool festivals where there's a high concentration of industry professionals, and how can you leverage that concentration of people to get your name out there and to network yourself? There's an element of putting yourself out there to network, and you might find that one of those conversations leads to opportunities down the road. With all that being said, let's do a quick pro and cons list and just run through some of the pros and cons of working in the knitting industry, of making knitting your job, to help you decide if it's something that you want to pursue. Some pros are obviously working in the industry of the hobby that you love, getting to think about and talk about yarn and knitting all day long. There's also the benefit of potentially getting some free or discounted yarn, some free or discounted knitting accessories, and that can be really fun too. And you may have the opportunity to attend knitting events, to represent the brand that you work for at knitting trunk shows, sheep and wool festivals, conferences, to travel a lot through knitting. And some cons are that if you get a job working in a knitting related company, you will likely earn less money than doing the same job at a non-knitting related company or a larger corporation. You might wind up getting burned out. When your hobby, the thing that you love and are passionate about, becomes your job, it may lose its joy and become something that you don't look forward to. So losing the joy of your hobby is a really major con, and I would underscore that 100 times for you. Really think about whether you want to risk losing your love of knitting by making it your job. I would recommend sitting down with a piece of paper and writing down all the reasons why you want to make knitting your job, the things that you would gain, the benefits that you'd gain, and then write down all of the risks. What do you stand to lose? You probably stand to lose money or a potential salary. You stand to lose the love of the craft, but you also stand to gain the joy of making this thing that you love into your job. And so how that will play out for you, it's different for everyone, but you have to really think about what's the right choice for you. So what are some practical next steps that you can take to try and make knitting your job? Maybe not this year, maybe next year. Let's try and make knitting your job in 2026. First, I would focus on building your social media following. Social media today is a knitter's portfolio, and anything that you're applying for, whether it be publishing a pattern in a magazine, whether it be reaching out to a publishing company and asking for a book deal, whether it be reaching out to a knitting related company and asking for a job there in any field, or to work with them for different projects, they are going to ask to see your social media handles first thing. Everybody's asking to see your social media. Try and build up a following and try to provide content that is useful and meaningful to people, whether that be inspirational, whether that be filling a niche. Create something that people want to see, because building your social media following will help you in any other arena that you want when you're building a career in knitting. While you're working on your social media, try and connect and start to network with some knitting brands that you're interested in, and just start to build that connection so that if there's an opportunity for you to meet them at a festival in the future, you'll kind of have that foot in the door, you'll have a little bit of a conversation started already. Start to build your portfolio within the professional world and start to shape it, if you can, to cater to the knitting world. Insert knitting into some of your work. Make sure that you have that prepared so your professional portfolio can start to feature some knitting in it. Evaluate your skill set and think about where you would be best suited to turn this into a job. Start to plan for 2025 to attend a couple of different knitting events where you can start to network, have some conversations, and build up your network a little bit of people who you know in the knitting world. Because folks in the knitting world know other folks in the knitting world. It is a small world. And so the more friends and connections you make in the knitting world, the more likely it is that someone can introduce you to somebody else who works in the company that you want to work for, and you can start to get your network building there. Don't forget, this takes time. It may take you months, it may take you years to get to a place where you are ready to take the leap to quit your day job and to make knitting your day job. But if you really, really want this, your patience will pay off. What do you think? Are you still interested in a job in the knitting industry, or are you going to leave it as a hobby? Let me know in the comments which path you choose. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to subscribe and like to let me know you liked it. Coming up next is my story of how I got into the knitting industry and why I quit my dream job as a knitting book editor. You won't want to miss it, so stay tuned. Bye.